It is February 19th, I believe, and so far this year I have read 10 manga and comic books, so here are those. The first comic book I read was Batman Shadow War, which is an event series where Ra's al Ghul, who is this immortal assassin, is assassinated by Deathstroke, who's another assassin, and Batman has to find the person who was actually a Deathstroke impersonator and not actually Deathstroke himself, who assassinated Ra's al Ghul, and prevent a war between Deathstroke's organization and the organization of Ra's al Ghul, which I believe they're both opposing assassin clans or something like that. And this person who impersonated Deathstroke wants them to go to a shadow war because they're both like shadow organizations. Because this is an event series, it takes place over multiple issues, which means there's multiple writers and multiple artists throughout the whole thing. I don't like event series very much. I find they're not particularly interesting with the characters. I find them kind of boring, and I feel about the same way as I did with this one. There's some character stuff in here, like with Damian Wayne, whose grandfather's Ra's al Ghul, and he was training with his mother, who is also an assassin, and wants to kill the person who killed Ra's al Ghul, and Batman is obviously against that because he has a no-kill rule. I think in the end he sides with Batman because he's Batman. I liked some of the artwork in this. None of it particularly stood out to me. I can't really imagine any panels or pages in my head from this, but I remember enjoying it. There's a big reveal at the end where the fake Deathstroke identity is revealed, and he is some guy I've never heard of. Maybe if you're a huge comic book fan, it would be really cool, but I have a feeling it was just sort of a reveal for a reveal, to be like, it's this guy. And I don't think it really worked, because I have no idea who that guy is. And also I didn't really care about most of what was going on. It really felt like action figures clashing against each other. The characters were underwhelming. Overall, I didn't hate this, or I think it was awful. It feels like a kid's book a lot of the time. Like I said, action figures clashing against each other. I didn't hate it. I didn't think it was good, though. The next comic I read was Fun Home, a family tragic comic, which is a graphic novel memoir written by Alice Bechtel. Yes, of that Alice Bechtel. Alice Bechtel? Alison Bechtel. Yes, that Alison Bechtel who made the Bechtel test. And this is a story about a memoir about her father and her relationship with her father, who was obsessed with organizing and refurbishing their home into sort of an art piece, and was also a latent homosexual or bisexual. And this is about her relationship with her father, who was very distant, had a lot of secrets, and her own sexuality, which she later in the book soon to discover herself, and then finds out that her father was also gay. The book starts with her speaking about her father's apparent suicide, which she believes was a suicide, but was deemed, I think, accidental manslaughter or something, but she thinks that he did it on purpose. And it's sort of an after-sun sort of thing, if you've seen that movie, where she's reflecting on her relationship with her father and trying to find clues and keys to his relationships with men, usually young men, sometimes teenage men, boys, and his mental health issues that led him to be so distant and that led to his suicide. I think Alison Bechtel is a really excellent writer, and I think she writes this very, very well. It's deeply moving, but sort of unsentimental in a way. Not unemotional or cold, but it's looking back on her life and moments within her life in a way that we can easily use as a reader to reflect on our own relationships with our family and with our own hidden secrets, desires, and things that we can't truly express or never had the opportunity to express. It feels empathetic in that sense, even though she sort of takes a cold distance to her father. There's a part in the story where after he dies, she talks about how she finds it odd that she doesn't feel sad at all, and then she goes to the funeral. I believe she sees his body, and it's not very daunting for her. Also maybe perhaps because she worked in a morgue. Her father was a mortician, and so she worked with dead bodies a lot. I really, really like this. It got turned into a Broadway musical at some point in time. I don't know what that would look like. I think it won a Tony Award. There are a lot of alliterations and references to literature, because her father was an avid reader, and then she, later in life, in college, became an avid reader. She likes literature. She can relate to him through that and uses literature as a way to explain her life. I saw a negative Goodreads review that called this pretentious. That's stupid, not pretentious. That's what art is for. Yeah, this one's really good. My library has a lot of graphic novel memoirs. I read like 4 or 5 from there at this point. A lot of really good ones. The next comic I read was the manga Barbara by Osamu Tezuka, who is the godfather of manga. I would also call the greatest manga writer to ever live, or at least the greatest whose work I've deeply explored. I've read probably 30 or 40 of his manga at this, maybe not that much, but I've read a lot of his manga. Barbara is about a writer, I think he's an absurdist writer, who meets a young woman named Barbara, who is a drunk young woman who he attaches to as his muse, but she is a rambunctious person who likes to drink and steal from people and cause trouble. And then as she becomes his muse, he starts hallucinating and imagining things that aren't real and talking to people who aren't real. It goes down this spiral where she eventually leaves him and then he can't write anymore, so he has to go out and find her, and he finds his mother. Her mother is a witch, I think. It gets pretty crazy. I think if you've ever read any Tezuka, his adult works are all very odd. They all have themes of sort of weird sexuality, weird plot structure. It's this whole book, the first 10 or so chapters feel like an anthology story, just set with this author character and Barbara, and they feel kind of disconnected from each other. But later on, it flows into a more continuous plot, where those previous things keep getting brought up. Tezuka really likes to, I think, end these stories with death. I won't spoil anything more beyond that. It's a hard manga to describe, and even to place thematically. I think it's about obsession. It feels like a lot of these stories, Tezuka is messing around. He wrote a lot. I think he wrote more manga than anyone ever. He wrote like 40 pages a week or something like that. He wrote hundreds of manga within his time. A lot of these are 10, 12 issues long. Sometimes he was writing 4 or 5 series at the same time. I'm presuming this is one that he was writing, publishing in a magazine alongside 5 others. So this one really feels like, and a lot of his, especially adult stuff, feels like he's sort of messing around with themes. Not even themes necessarily. He's messing around with these ideas and concepts that are hard to articulate, because I don't even know if he's necessarily approaching it from a thematic angle. This one's hard to describe, as is any Tezuka. I love his artwork. His style of humor, he's always able to insert humor, sometimes fourth wall breaks, sometimes pop culture references that never feel out of place, or if they do feel out of place, they don't feel unwelcome. I think he's a master of contrasting tones. He makes very silly, sometimes cartoonish manga, but that are also deeply sad and weird and sometimes creepy and perverted, but they always have that weird light sense of humor to them. His tonal contrast, I think, is what makes his work stand out so much. I would say he has a control of tone. He kind of lets tone run wild a lot, but it never feels wrong. And he always writes something interesting. And I think Barbara's pretty interesting. It's got a couple, I think, problematic stuff within there. I think Barbara's like 17, so... And he, I think, wants to marry her in the end. But it was, I believe, the 70s, so... Still sucks, but it's an interesting manga. I would recommend this one. I don't know if it has an English translation. I read it online, so it might not. The next comic I read was Rat God by Richard Corbin. His most popular stuff, at least on Goodreads, is H.P. Lovecraft adaptations and Edgar Allan Poe adaptations, so he wrote a lot of horror stuff. This is a story about a white man who falls in love with a Native American woman and then abandons her when he finds out she's a nude model for painting, and he thinks that's gross. It takes place in the 1920s, so he thinks that's wrong. And then he goes to track her down again, I believe to marry her, maybe, and finds this village of half-animal people who are all Native Americans who have hidden away from the world, and they worship a rat god. And then he goes there to save her and find her, meets a bunch of weird characters, ends up killing some people. Along the way, he finds out he has Native American heritage, and as the story goes along, each issue, his skin gets redder and darker. And so at the beginning, he's very white. At the end, he looks native alongside the other people. I really loved Richard Corbin's artwork. I think it's really beautiful looking. It's very blocky. All the characters look... It's a very interesting and sort of creepy look that makes all the characters kind of look ugly. As a story, I think it doesn't fully come together. I think it has some interesting criticisms of its main character, who is sort of posited as this side of, like, awful kind of racist guy who learns that he's part native, and then in the end, when he becomes ostracized by society, he sort of returns to that place and has to live among them. But I also think representing Native American people as being half animal and worshipping a rat god feels like they are not necessarily normal people. Like, they're like a magical forest, I think, that, like, no one else can access. They worship this, like, deity thing that isn't really, like, Native American based. It's just this, like, it's like a demon or something. But it still feels somewhat troublesome, especially with the characterization of a couple other characters in here. There's a girl in here who's, like, this young Native American woman who speaks like, sort of like a child, and keeps trying to sleep with the main character. And I see this in some stuff when they're trying to portray someone as lesser or, like, less intelligent, they'll characterize them in that way. Just this person who can't control their urges, so she just, like, throws herself at him, sort of in an animalistic way. And I think that's kind of lame. I'm like a white guy from Texas, so I don't think I'm the right guy to look at how racist this thing is, but it did have a somewhat of a bad vibe. I don't think the comic is completely garbage. Despite that, I think it has some strengths, especially that artwork. But perhaps I just need to read more of Richard Corbin's work and find stuff that isn't this. Although maybe H.P. Lovecraft is not the person to read if I don't want to. Maybe it's all bad. I don't know. The next manga I read was Black Paradox by Junji Ito. Junji Ito is, I guess you could call him the master of Japanese horror manga. He wrote Uzumaki, he wrote Tomi, he wrote Gyo. This is a story about 4 people who want to commit suicide, and so they get together. I think one of them is a robot, one of them is a ghost, who have tricked this woman into trying to commit suicide with them. So she leaves and then finds the original people who the ghost and robot were based on, who also want to kill themselves, so they go and kill themselves. And in attempting to fail to kill themselves, the character poisons himself and then starts spitting up these balls of crystal, or like mineral. They burst from him and he explodes, and a bunch of them come from him. And then this mineral is a new mineral, which the 2 of them start selling. And then they find more purpose in life by getting really rich off of this mineral. But the mineral also kills people. And the mineral is also the souls of the dead. Maybe that's all I'm about to say. I think there's so much more happens in this. It's so short and it's so absurd. Junji Ito, I think, is a horror author. But I always think of him as a horror comedy author. Because he's very weird. And I think he knows he's being weird. And I think he knows he often ends his stories to not necessarily give you scares, but to make you uncomfortable. And sometimes they work, and sometimes they don't, and sometimes they just come across as funny, which I also think sometimes is intentional. I like this one. I like all of Junji Ito's work. I don't think I've read anything of his that I particularly have disliked. I haven't read any of his that I particularly like. Uzumaki's pretty great. This one does get pretty freaky. There's some, like, parts where people's faces are melting off. There's a part where they go to another dimension that's made out of, like, people's flesh. Or the portal is made out of people's flesh, and then they get rich off of the minerals in that dimension. I realize I'm sort of just naming weird stuff that's happening in this, because I can't really articulate what any of it means. I don't really know what Junji Ito is attempting to say with this. Maybe it's about fame. Maybe it's about the hollowness of finding meaning through things like money. Maybe it's about that. It's a weird manga. It's a weird manga that's, I think, really, really good, though. So, my library had it. Shout out my library. The next manga I read, I actually have with me, because I rented it from the library, and I just finished it a few days ago, and I haven't returned it yet. The Wolf Never Sleeps. This is an isekai about a man from a world with dungeons and abilities and magic. It's a sort of dark world where you have to fight to get to the top. gets isekai'd to a different world with more based on Germanic lore, and so people speak what sounds approximately like German, and it's a much more peaceful, sort of like royal, noble place, and he has to learn to adjust to this new world and live among it. This has a lot of the trappings of traditional isekai. He's somewhat of a power fantasy character. He has more magic than anyone here. He's sort of a stoic badass. But where I think this manga really shines is the tone it's able to strike up. This is a story about a guy going around defeating monsters, learning from an ancient witch, stopping bad guys, things like that. But it's able to do this all and feel very cozy, and I think that's because the main character doesn't necessarily have a quest to go out for. He doesn't have a grand purpose that he finds in this new world. He just has to sort of make his way, and by doing that he befriends people, he explores around, starts adventuring with some people, goes to dungeons. But he's also, while being stoic and sort of silent, he's kind and does what he can to help other people. And most of the other characters are also that. Most of the other characters are sort of genuine people who thinks he's interesting. They don't really hate him. I guess some people do think he's weird for being from another world, but he's invited to work at the castle guard to a princess after he saves her life. And then later he leaves and goes and meets a witch to learn magic from her. And all the while, he learns about the world, meets some people, keeps moving on. I think it's a very comfortable book. I really like how cozy it feels. Unfortunately, it only lasted 3 issues. I don't know if it was canceled or if this is where the author intended to end. I assume it wasn't because it sort of ends sort of abruptly. But I also think that the series wasn't particularly well liked. I don't think, from what I see, it has like mediocre ratings. So maybe this is just a me thing, but I found it pretty fun. I think it lacks all the problems I have with isekai, which is unrelenting power fantasy, mistreatment of female characters. It lacks all of those things. It's just a guy going to a new world, adjusting to it, meeting people, sort of wandering around a bit. Maybe that's why people didn't like it, because it doesn't have a central plot, but I found it really comfortable. It was a really fun read at night, and I was really, really disappointed when I found out this was the final issue. My library also had this, so shout out libraries. Libraries, if you're shout out your library, go check out your library, see if it has a good manga and comic book section, because I've read a bunch of stuff from there that I've never heard about before. The next comic I read was X-Men, God Loves, Man Kills, which is a single issue graphic novel, I believe. I don't know if it was released in small format or just the trade paperback. This is about a religious extremist who seeks to kill all X-Men in the name of God. This is a very clearly political allegory. It's not even a political allegory, it just is. It's about how persecution against people who are different, there's very clear assimilations between the mutant experience and the African American experience and the experience of homosexuals and LGBT folk. This is written by Chris Claremont, who is the writer of all of the famous X-Men stories, Days of Future Past, The Phoenix, whatever that one's called. I've read some of Uncanny X-Men, but not all of it. And so in this story, the X-Men, Professor Xavier is captured by this religious extremist, and his mind is sort of tortured and transformed to make him hate mutants and want to kill all mutants. And because he is so powerful, he would be able to kill all of mutant kind, which is what the religious leader wants and what he's pushing for. And he's this big public figure who is anti-mutant, and then they fight against him. X-Men God Loves, Man Kills is I think, sort of one of the quintessential X-Men comics. It's like the 3rd highest rated thing on League of Comic Geeks, if that means anything. The artwork and writing in this is pretty excellent. I out of all of the Marvel comics, X-Men is the one that I found to be the most interesting and consistently engaging. A lot of the themes that underline its work are really flushed out and explicitly stated here and handled in a way that it leaves no imagination. That's what this story is about, the mutants. X-Men is a story about persecution. And I think that's think that's when it works at its best, as opposed to the more sci-fi stuff. It can get, but that stuff's fun. But I prefer this stuff, the more grounded character work that's focused on a persecuted people, persecuted by their nation, persecuted by zealots. Yeah, really good X-Men comic. One of the better ones I've read. The next comic I read was The Singularity by, I don't remember who, but this is a graphic novel made as part of a multimedia thing by composer Bear McCreary. He did the composition for, I believe, the Rings of Power TV show. This has music, I think, that goes along with it, but I didn't know that while I was reading it. I only found that out afterwards, so maybe that's like a good way to experience it. This is a story about a guy who keeps dying, and when he dies, he is sent to a different multiverse where he experiences a different life and all of its memories, and then dies again, and then is sent to a different one, and he experiences all of these lives one after one, and it's quickening, and he's dying faster and faster. He used to spend his entire life in a multiverse before it was destroyed, but now he's spending seconds, and he meets a golden woman who's always present. Everything is destroyed around him by this red mist, and that golden woman tells him that he is a multiversal being. He is not a he is the multiversal being, so he is, every life that has ever been lived in that universe was him, and he is now lived like almost every life that has ever existed, and so he is dying, and the multiverse will die with him. And it is a story about him accepting his own death, and it flashes back to his very first life where he has to sort of reflect on his wife's death and his, I believe, daughter's death. This is The Egg by Andy Weir. It's a short story. This is sort of taking that idea but adding a little bit more to it. I found this extremely corny and cheesy, but in a way that was sort of enjoyable. Like, you get into it, and as it's happening, you know everything that's going to happen, and sort of all of the emotions it's going to try to draw from that. It's not breaking any new grounds or particularly trying to, I don't think. The artwork is also, I think, decent most of the time. There's a few characters that look really weird. Overall, I think it looks pretty good, though. Overall, I think this is one I read on a whim. I don't remember. I think the cover looks pretty cool, so I checked it out, and it was not as interesting as I hoped it would be. But it's not the worst thing ever. I don't know, if you want to read, just read The Egg by Andy Weir. It's the same thing. The next manga I read was Ocean Rush, or also called Umigahashira End Roll, by John Terashine, which I don't think is actually his name. I think it's a fake name, because he doesn't, reveal himself. This is a manga about a 70-year-old woman who joins film school, a 4-year film school, after her husband's death, and becomes a filmmaker. This is a deeply emotional manga about a woman using art to come to terms with her own emotions, her grief, her loneliness throughout her life, the complicated emotions that led to her joining film school. It's also about the other students at film school, specifically this one student who she attaches to and is the lead star in most of the films she makes in school. They grow to have a friendship and eventually sort of grow apart, but still always think of each other and continue to work together a little bit. There are moments of this that I find deeply, deeply moving. I found it online before it ever got officially translated, so it was a fan translation that I read mostly. So I've been following it for a while now, probably it might be years at this point, 2 years that I've been sort of somewhat keeping up with it, and it just recently ended, I believe a couple weeks ago. So as I'm following the story, I think there's a lot of it that moved me a lot. I believe there are 1 or 2 moments that brought tears to my eyes. I think it's a beautiful manga when it works, but I think there are times when the emotions feel so broad and vacant and sometimes hollow, to the point where it sort of hammers home a lot of these similar, same emotional beats and ideas to the point where they sort of don't work. There's a lot of this that does not work for me, but I have a feeling some of it might just be me, but I think this leans sometimes too much into those big, not big emotional moments, but those those emotions instead of letting us sit with these characters and let them interact and let them make their films and watch them through the process of making their films. There's a lot skipped over within the process of actual filmmaking and them talking about filmmaking and films themselves, and I feel like there is a lot lost in that, because I think the process is where she finds meaning. When we don't really see the process, it makes it difficult to attach to her as a character, and it makes the comic feel like it's missing something, at least to me. I still think it's a really, really good series. I kept reading it, and I was excited every time a new issue was come out. Not every chapter worked for me, but I think if you get the chance to read this one, I think this one's you should check it out. It's pretty good. The final manga I read, or at least the 10th manga I've read so far, is Shiver by Junji Ito. This is a short story collection of like 15 short stories he wrote, varying in quality. I think they're all pretty good. There's this one about flying heads. I don't know if you can see that. It might not be clear at all. But there's a short story about flying heads where your own face will be this like giant flying balloon that will chase you down and try to hang you. There's also a story that I really liked about, not ironically liked, but I think the short story doesn't necessarily fully work as a horror thing, and it feels somewhat comedic in its execution. It's about a guy who sees the photo of a scary-looking woman in a fashion magazine, and then her face haunts his dreams, and then years later he becomes a filmmaker, and she applies to be an actor, and the other people are like, we have to have her in the movie because you've had nightmares about her. And then when they're shooting the movie with her, the big scary woman just kills all of them. There's really no precursor to it. There's really no, they're not like mean to her or anything. They're not necessarily like, she shows up and then she has like shark teeth, I think, and she eats them. There's two short stories with that character. They're both exactly the same. They're like that. I'm pretty sure it's intended to be silly because it's really funny. Somewhat disturbing still. I still think, despite the fact that it sort of doesn't fully work well, it's still a lot of fun. This has the short story, if you've ever seen the image, I'm not going to show it because it's too gross, of the guy squeezing his face and then like pouring pus onto someone. That's in this. It's disgusting, it's disturbing. That one's a story about where it's a family who lives above a barbecue restaurant, and so all the grease gets up into the house, and then so their skin always has pores on it, and they always have a bunch of pimples. Like I said previously with Junji Ito, his stuff is a lot of fun, but also not particularly scary all the time. Sometimes a little bit freaky, but I think he has a comedic sense to him. The comics don't always end on a big scare or like a truly scary moment. Sometimes they just end. Like the Grease one sort of just ends. There was one in here that I really, really liked about these people who get obsessed with a lost recording of a woman who sings as she dies, or not as she dies, her body was already dead, and then she sings, and then they get obsessed with the recording, and they just want to listen to it over and over again. That one's, I think, probably the most consistent and complete one out of all of them. It's the one that I think its ending feels deserved, and not just kind of like it ended. Because sometimes they just end, which is fine. I still undoubtedly have fun with these. I always have fun with Junji Ito. I always check out his stuff into the library or when I see it online. Let me see if I can... That's the scary woman. Can you see that? Is that viewable? If not, I'm cutting this out. Can you see her? She just shows up and kills people for no apparent reason. I've been thinking about that short story a lot. I really like that short story. It's really funny. These are pretty great. I have a feeling this video was just me rambling a lot. I don't know if I actually articulated why I like these and why not. But if I did, and you liked the video, and it's uploaded and I didn't delete it all, leave recommendations for manga and comics in the description. I think it'd be cool to do a video of just reading what other people recommend me, because I kind of just pick stuff randomly or whatever's at my library. One more final shout out to libraries.